Oh, wait, what the heck? Yeah, Bloodborne review. Yeah, let's get on that. Oh, yeah, the knife's to open the box, right? Before we continue further, just want to point out that we got timestamps in the description below if you want to jump to anywhere in particular. So I am a huge fan of Miyazaki, From Software, and their games. Played through all of them, cried a lot, but also got good. So when I found out there was a Bloodborne tabletop game, I had to hop on that. So let's see how Hunting the Beasts of Yharnam translates into the cardboard world. Bloodborne the card game is a semi-co-op card game for 3 to 5 players that takes 30 to 60 minutes to play. The game is based on the Chalice Dungeons in the video games, which were procedurally generated levels you could explore that had random bosses thrown in occasionally. In the card game, this is represented with a deck of monsters that you're trying to clear, with bosses shuffled within it. And true to the original game, Bloodborne, the card game, has a lot of risk management in it, where players must constantly push their luck in their ravenous efforts to amass the most blood echoes from their foes. Also, blood echoes are your points in this game. You win by having the most blood echoes. And you know what? I'm calling it just blood. We're calling it blood for the rest of the review. Let's see what you get inside the box of Bloodborne the card game. A game by Eric M. Lang. Okay, first up, you got your rulebook. Very beautiful looking rulebook. My god, it just screams the Bloodborne aesthetic. Love it a lot. Next, you got 5 of these player boards. You're gonna get 5 of these Pearl Slug tokens, 5 of these Human Skull tokens, 5 of these Beast Claw tokens, 5 of these Hunter Health dials. You got 3 dice, and you got a whole bunch of blood, which I don't really want to take out, but we're doing it anyways, because I don't know why, they're really just crammed tight in there. These are 5 final bosses, and then you get a whole metric buttload of cards. So I'm first gonna go through this stack of cards. So you're gonna get a bunch of starting items. These are the cards that players will start with when playing the game. Okay, let's see. Next up, we got a whole bunch of those monsters that you use to make the monster deck. Next, you have 7 boss cards. 7? Yeah, 7. They're gonna get shuffled in along with the monsters. And then you get 32 Hunter upgrade cards. Oh wait, right, one more thing. Totally forgot about this. This is the first player token. It's a cute little stand-up, you can prop it up on stuff. And that is everything inside the Bloodborne card game box. Okay, so the goal of this game is to get the most amount of blood when players complete the dungeon run of 7 monsters, 3 bosses, and a final boss. There are 2 main ways to get blood: hurting monsters and killing them. Yeah, I know, right? Pretty obvious. The game doesn't have individual turns, but rather rounds. And on a round, everyone's gonna put a card, usually a weapon of some sort, face down in front of them. And then, once everyone's ready, everyone's gonna flip. Then, whatever monster is currently out is gonna roll a die depending on its lantern color. Green die is the easiest die, red die is the hardest. This does big damage. It then deals that much damage to all players. The plus sign on a dice means roll again and add that damage cumulatively. So it's possible everyone just gets one shot because you can just keep rolling the plus over and over again. Everyone takes 8 damage, you all die. Once damage is resolved, players who are still alive get to attack the monster with their weapons. They take blood from it equal to the damage of the damage you're dealing. And they add it to their collection. Collection's up your banks down there. If the monster dies, everyone who did damage around also gets a trophy of that monster's type. It's in the bottom right of the card. In this case, you would get boom, boom. Trophies award bonus points at the end of the game. Also, the card that you played, your weapon card, will go into individual discard pile in front of you. In this game, death isn't the end. When you die, you simply lose all of the blood from your collection, not the bank. And you get to grab an upgrade card that's available from the upgrade deck before coming back into the fray next round with full health. However, everyone starts with this card called the Hunter's Dream, where if you play it, it lets you take half damage that turn instead of dealing damage. And if you survive, it lets you move all your collected blood into your bank, where it is now permanently safe. You add everything that was in your discard pile back to your hand, including the Hunter's Dream. Doing this also lets you get an upgrade card, and it also brings you back up to max health. You repeat this core gameplay loop of killing monsters, sometimes dying, banking blood, and getting upgrades until you kill all the monsters and bosses in the monster deck, see who got the most blood at the end of the game, and you declare them the winner. So now that you're more familiar with Bloodborne, the card game, let's get to actually reviewing the game. Let's start with what we think is good about the game. First, Bloodborne, the card game, is pretty faithful to its source material. All the weapons, items, and enemies are straight out of the game. And the aesthetic also looks straight out of the game. And you also die a lot, losing a whole bunch of blood in the process. That's also straight out of the game. The components are all pretty good, no complaints there. These little blood pieces and health dials are very clean ways of doing points and health. The rulebook also looks very, very nice, and it has phenomenal art. And in addition to that, has a ton of examples alongside its explanations when explaining the game's mechanics. For the gameplay, we gotta commend the designers for doing the card managing aspect of the game well. Stuff like deciding when to play your cards and when to hold on to them, what to swap out when getting new upgrades, as well as the great variety of effects to promote thoughtful decision making. The upgrade cards are the heart and soul of this game's progressions and most of its cool effects. And it's where you'll find cards like the Flame Sprayer, Cannons, Molotovs. These are cards that actually disrupt other players. What this ultimately does is set up a rock, paper, scissors scenario where players are going to try to guess what other players are trying to play. Not only are you navigating the monster's potential damage, but also potential cards from others that can completely fuck you over. It's a pretty cool blend of trying to stay alive, getting the most damage, last hitting, and screwing with other players. It's also a good way to keep people in check if they get upgrades that allow them to deal tons of damage so that others can attempt to kill them before they can bank their blood. Also, I didn't mention this in the summarize how to play, but there's a final boss that you have to pick for your run, which alters the game's rules, while also serving as a pretty good endpoint for the game, a proper finale. The rule altering is unique for each different boss, so each of them offers different ways to play the game. All right, now for the not so good stuff about this game. The first thing we're gonna complain about are the bosses. They don't really feel that far off in power compared to the final boss, which probably should be the strongest big bad guy. We feel like the final boss needs even more health than they already have, and they should have like some sort of actual combat effect in addition to their game altering effect. Because as it stands, they're just a vanilla guy that alters the game. They don't have anything that's unique about their own fight. Enemies in general also need more unique attacks and effects aside from just being a default die roller. Oh cool, I take that much damage. That's all they do. Well, some of them at least, most of them. Part of the reason why so many bosses and enemies blend together is because some of them just straight up have effects that benefit the players by just giving them free shit instead of having cool effects and abilities that actually affect the gameplay. This makes it so that for a good chunk of enemies in the game, the only way they threaten you is just with the dice, which doesn't really help the game differentiate the encounters. Next, upgrading in the late game is basically useless. Another rule that we left out in the summarize how to play is that everyone has a limit of 7 cards across their hand and discard pile. Going above 7 means you gotta throw a card out of the game, which you'll quickly be doing very early on since you begin with 5 starter cards, before eventually doing this to every new card you get if you build a good hand later on. We mention this because it feels like Bloodborne the card game has a pacing issue. Some monsters and bosses are gonna be way too hard for the players if you get them early, like getting one of these big, hard, red rolling die bosses on the first turn. Others are massive jokes if you hit them in the late game. This one has very low health and rolls green die. And the weird timing of getting fully stacked with good upgrade cards in the mid game only furthers this problem. Granted, it is impossible to outright lose the game, so maybe this doesn't really matter to get a hard boss or something very early on, but it still feels really dumb to like actually play through when the difficulty's all out of sync. Actually, wait, quick little addendum. You can actually lose the game, and it's through this final boss, Rom the Vacuous Spider. While this guy is cool for actually forcing the players to be much more cooperative since his effect is dying twice, actually just eliminates you from the game, This is ultimately way too punishing in a game where players can just randomly die in one hit. Player elimination should always be more slow and gradual so that if it does happen, it happens near the end so people don't have to sit out as long. And also so there's more expectation to it. But the inherent design of this game's dice means that the window is always open for early eliminations. He also just slows down the game like crazy since players will be probably playing the Hunter's Dream card very, very often to stay alive. Bloodborne, the card game, would also greatly benefit from upgrade cards that can directly target another player with negative effects since there's no comeback mechanics. It's very difficult to individually focus on taking down one player since all negative effects are global. If someone shoots ahead in blood, it's going to be very hard to catch up to them if they just play safe and don't die. Oh yeah, also the scaling kind of sucks in this game. Playing with 5 people results in having way too much group damage, and you can just obliterate enemies, oftentimes leaving out the people who have to go last in a round. Granted, enemies get 2 more health in a 5-player game, but that's definitely not enough. 5 players also means that it's more likely that more harmful cards are played each round, meaning that players are going to get damaged way more from their teammates. It's also super punishing to take your turn last, and you'll very often miss out on getting damage in if that's the case. Lastly, some nitpick stuff that I want to mention. First is that my insert is way too cramped for all the blood tokens. It is very difficult to remove them and put them back in. Also, the trophy tokens, they kind of just tend to fall out all over the place when I move this game around. Next, as someone who's played Bloodborne the video game quite extensively, I question why this game was designed to be competitive instead of just being co-op. The theme of hurting other people with cannons and molotovs doesn't really make sense because in the game, you can't actually hurt each other unless you're specifically invading someone else's world where you're trying to actually hunt down that guy and kill them while they're trying to just progress through a level. But in that case, literally anything will hurt them. If they wanted the game to be truly semi-co-op while also still being faithful to Bloodborne, then they could just put that mechanic in the game. There should have just been that invasion mechanic where a player can ally themselves with the monster for the round and attack other players in an attempt to steal their blood. Also, I'm kind of annoyed that there aren't more Chalice Dungeon specific bosses thrown in here. Most of the enemies in here are from the main campaign, but there's plenty of Chalice Dungeon monsters that aren't in here for some reason. The fact that there isn't a single Thumerian in here is really fucking bizarre.
Now onto the scoring. Here at Shelfside, we have things a little bit different because we got 2 people running the channel. First, we give the recommender score, which is how we try to evaluate the game as objectively as possible by weighing the aforementioned pros and cons. Next, the 2 of us are going to give you our personal scores, which are our own opinions about the game.
For the recommender score, we're going to give Bloodborne the card game a 5 out of 10. It's an average game. While it absolutely nails the Bloodborne aesthetic, the theme fails to meet the gameplay in the ways that I'd hoped. Because of this, it's going to be a hard sell to people who haven't played Bloodborne the video game, since the gameplay is pretty meh. For those who have played Bloodborne, the novelty of the theme is going to wear off fast. Especially when you look at the enemies and weapons and go like, wait, why does it do that? I don't ever remember that guy giving me free blood in the game. Why doesn't my weapon have 2 different modes? Oh wait, there's a transform card, but it lets me switch between melee and ranged weapons and doesn't actually transform my weapon. Did the designers even play Bloodborne?
Our biggest gripes with the gameplay can be summarized under the poor pacing and lack of interesting mechanics from the enemies. Bosses need to just be better at being bosses, and the semi-co-op doesn't really offer anything interesting since there's no harm in the other players dying. And the player scaling is off on top of everything else. While it's cool to amass a sweet stack of weapons and play mind games with other players, it's very hard to play around the random damage of the monsters. And while dying instantly is pretty thematic in the video game, it doesn't really translate well into a board game.
If Bloodborne the card game is going to keep the constant dying and potential for instant deaths in the game, it should play to its strengths and lean more heavily into this push your luck aspect. We feel like the game would have been much more tense if players had more maximum health, so they didn't need to visit the Hunter's Dream as much, resulting in much more scenarios for players to really push just how greedy they can get and stay in the fight, and also way less random instant deaths. There also should have been instant speed cards that you can play from your hand to react to things and further interact with the game and other players. And you know what would have been perfect for that? The item cards, which totally makes sense for being the trick up the sleeve that hunters can pull out of nowhere as a surprise.
Ultimately, we don't really recommend this game if you're not already interested in it, for both those who have and haven't played the video game Bloodborne. Check it out if you want to, because it's not really a bad game, but we can't really praise it for anything spectacular. If you're looking for something similar with the whole setting a card, everyone flips simultaneously style of semi-co-op, we'd recommend Cutthroat Caverns, which has much better gameplay than Bloodborne the card game, and we even got a review for it up there.
Alright, also one more thing, Bloodborne the card game has an expansion which we do not own. From what I've read on Board Game Geek, it does improve the game and introduce new rules and mechanics, plus even more monsters and upgrades than the amount that was in the base game. So, fuck me if it turns out that we've just been playing an inferior version of this game all this time.
My personal score is going to be a 4 out of 10, a below average game. See, I haven't played Bloodborne the video game, and Daniel keeps raving about it, and the universe seems really cool, the combat seems awesome, amazing. But when I played Bloodborne, the card game, as much as I wanted to like it, I tend to be not too engrossed in the experience. This mostly stems from how points are scored, which are harvesting blood from monsters, but I guess this is thematic, but in a board game I don't really feel too excited, and I just feel like I'm farming tokens from creatures, when instead I should be gorging on the blood of demons and like. I don't get that from this game. What adds on to my apathy about this game is that the finale is so anticlimactic, with it feeling just like a normal fight. I've had too many disengaging moments with this game, from falling behind early and then not doing anything, or taking a lead early and then just cruising and winning off trophy points. What also bugged me is that this game really just feels like it's riding off the brand of Bloodborne, without much correlation to the essence of the actual video game. I didn't even play Bloodborne the video game, and I feel like this card game is nothing like how Daniel described Bloodborne to me.
Alright, time for my personal score of Bloodborne. I personally scored this game a 7 out of 10. I'm usually very down to play it, but I feel like that's because I just like Bloodborne as an IP so much. Like we've said in the cons, the card game doesn't really portray the video game that well. It gets some stuff right, but I have a hard time imagining what I'm seeing in the card game happening in the video game. The gameplay itself is pretty serviceable, but I feel like it could have been so much better. I also know all the cards in the deck by now and pretty much just kind of play on autopilot, so the gameplay is pretty mad at me as a result. I don't think that's a good sign, and I wouldn't really recommend picking this game up unless you're really into Bloodborne like me. However, me and Ashton have talked extensively about potential house rules that would fix the game, stuff like giving everyone way more health, so they dream less, so the upgrades come more slowly, starting with more cards, increasing boss health, having bosses feel like you if everyone's dead or dreaming, which is tons of examples, right? There's a shitload of stuff that can be done in this game to better experience. But these rule changes are so drastic that you're basically playing a whole other game at that point. So yeah, like it's a 7 out of 10, it's a good game for me, but that's just because I just like Bloodborne so much that like the love of the IP is just carrying it. Bloodborne, the card game, to me at least, feels like a game where someone told the designers about how Bloodborne worked, and then they tried to haphazardly shove those ideas into a card game to various levels of success. Feels like someone told them though. I'm really confused because while doing research for this game, I watched an interview with Eric M. Lane, the lead designer of Bloodborne the card game, and I'm pretty sure he's played Bloodborne with great enthusiasm, so I'm really confused by his design decisions. Regardless, they got a lot of things right, like the Hunter's Dream, losing blood, banking blood, the general aesthetic, but then everything else about the game doesn't really represent Bloodborne the video game that well. The game that we do have as a result of this is an okay game that could have been a whole lot better had they either A, made more mechanics that were more faithful to the source material, or B, went way harder on what they have here and turned it into the coolest push your luck game ever. I have a sinking feeling that B is what happens if you buy the expansion, which we'll probably cover in the indeterminate future. That's gonna be it though for this Bloodborne, the card game review. If you're interested in buying this game, we got a purchase link down in the description below. Feel free to also pick up the expansion and tell us how it went. We'll put a link for it in the below as well for funsies. That's gonna be it for though this Shelfside review of Bloodborne, the card game. Thank you all for tuning in and watching us, and we'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.